Creepy photos can say 1,000 words, but sometimes even that's not enough to do justice to the disturbing backstories behind these scary locations and the unsettling history that happened there. Number 5. There are no shortages of disturbing images from the Chernobyl nuclear site. Whether it's the remains of the reactor, photos from the initial event, or the now derelict amusement park that sits still waiting for the population to return, there's definitely enough eerie photos of the places humans left behind. Possibly even more disturbing, though, are the photos of the trees inside what has become known as the Red Forest. It was just after midnight on April 26, 1986, when a fire at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant sent radioactive particles, dust, and debris into the atmosphere. The pine tree forest that surrounded the site saw the brunt of the blast and actually did some work in shielding the land further out from the worst radioactivity. In doing so, the trees themselves were badly damaged. In one section of the forest west of the site, the pine needles turned a reddish orange, earning the forest a new nickname, the Red Forest. It looks eerily beautiful, but it was a clear sign something was very wrong. The trees had absorbed a large amount of radiation. Many that were at the front of the blast were no longer alive, and the dry, radioactive wood led to fears of a forest fire that could send radiation back into the area. The worst-hit trees were buried, and new shrubs and saplings were planted on top to try to keep the sandy soil in place. Despite the worst parts being cleared, the forest is still a disturbing sight. Whether it's rows upon rows of black, gnarled trees, or still living trees that have grown into a twisted mess, it's easy to see that something unnatural has happened here. With the clearing, the once brilliant bright orange has faded, but from satellite images it's easy to see the patch of land more reddish in color than the rest of the forest. It's a small hint at how radioactive the forest still is today. Even decades after the event, radiation has led to some worrying findings. In 2014, a study found that many of the trees and discarded trees were not decaying properly. Lots of dry plant matter lined the forest floor, with microbes and fungus unable to survive in the radioactive soil. There was a worry this would cause a massive forest fire. The following year, the predictions came true. Then in 2020, another series of large forest fires burned through parts of the radioactive forest, sending smoke towards the Ukrainian capital. Luckily, there didn't seem to have been much in the way of radioactive fallout, except in the areas directly around the fire. But photographs from the disaster definitely look like something post-apocalyptic. Number 4. There's definitely something eerie about photos of the rust-red gates outside Crossbones Graveyard in Southwark, London. The gates are lined with countless ribbons, flowers, and charms. It's a shrine of sorts, and supposed to be something of a celebration. But its connection to the afterlife can make the images somewhat spooky. Crossbones Graveyard is not an ordinary graveyard. For decades, it has been lost to time. It was only when Transport for London started to dig a new tunnel for the London Underground that they realized what was below the ground at the site they had recently purchased. Workers found skeletons packed closely together. It could almost be considered a mass grave. Such grave sites aren't exactly unusual in London, and many plague pits have been discovered during work on the London Underground. But this wasn't a plague pit. It dated back only to the late medieval times and had been in use until the 17th century. The graveyard was originally described as a single woman's churchyard. Southwark lay outside London's city walls and was effectively under control of the Bishop of Winchester between the 12th and 17th century. Things that were illegal in London were commonplace here, and the bishop himself gave licenses to single women to do sexual work. However, the licenses didn't stop the church from seeing them as sinful, and they were buried in unhallowed land. In Victorian times, they were joined by the remains of people living in disease-infested slums around the graveyard. Cholera was a major problem, and lots of the bodies that were later found at the site showed signs of the disease. In the 1850s, the graveyard was closed as it was described as being completely overcharged with bodies. It was briefly sold to a building company before locals formed a petition to leave the area undeveloped. Over the years, the graveyard was forgotten about, leading to the TFL discovery in the 1990s. Since then, with the help of a series of literary pieces by the writer John Constable, the graveyard has seen some recognition that it deserves. Along with the shrine on the gates, the area has been turned into a garden of remembrance, but skulls positioned within the gardens and statues of angels mean it's now hard to forget the dark and disturbing history of the site. Number 3. Sunland Hospital in Orlando, Florida is now mostly demolished, but those hoping to get a sense of just how eerie and unsettling the building was need only to look at the creepy photos taken by urban and paranormal explorers. Sunland Hospitals were a chain of hospitals in operation between the 60s and 70s that were supposed to look after the mentally ill and physically disabled people. Almost all of the buildings were taken over from W.T. Edwards hospitals that were designed to treat tuberculosis and had large windows in patient rooms. The Orlando Hospital was the only one that wasn't originally an Edwards hospital. At first, things at the hospital were going well, but as is so often the case, they quickly took a turn for the worst. Doctors at the time didn't know how to properly treat the mental and physical health conditions that patients were dealing with, but funding was by far the biggest problem. The hospitals were understaffed and overcrowded, with 100 patients per ward in some places. The Orlando Hospital was one of the worst. Rat infestations, malnutrition, and unsafe surgical conditions were just some of the issues. But there were also people in positions of care who would physically strike patients. Finally, in the late 1970s, reports of the mistreatment came to light. In 1978, a lawsuit was filed on behalf of the patients, and a few years later, all of the Sunland hospitals, including Orlando, were closed down. The derelict buildings became a hub for people looking for paranormal activity, and in Orlando at least, it's believed that they found what they were looking for. Explorers reported hearing the cries and voices of former patients, and sometimes even seeing apparitions, including the shadow of someone hanging from the ceiling. In 1997, a man playing hide-and-seek in the building fell down an elevator shaft and lost his life. Police responding to the incident reported seeing a boy looking out from one of the windows on the second story of the building. They searched for the child but turned up nothing, adding further weight to the rumors that there was something or someone supernatural there. A petition caused the main building of the hospital to be torn down in 1999. But the paranormal activity hasn't stopped just yet. A park with a playground now lies where the hospital once stood. In the daytime, there's no sign of the disturbing happenings that once went on here. But at night, it's said that some of the spirits of the patients can be seen playing in the playground. Number 2. In northern Tanzania, there lies a lake that has produced some of the most disturbing photographs of statue-like animals and waters that run red. Lake Natron's brilliant red color can be seen from satellite images and resembles something from a horror movie. It's a relief to know the water doesn't get its distinct color from great acts of violence that leave hundreds without their lives. The truth behind it is a different kind of disturbing. In ancient times, a volcanic eruption led to lava flows with high levels of sodium and potassium in the area surrounding the lake. Over time, those minerals have flowed into the lake. As Lake Natron doesn't have any rivers flowing out of it, the only way water can leave the lake is through evaporation. Between this and the minerals flowing into the lake, the remaining water has become a salty brine, suitable to only a few species of bacteria that leave the lake a brilliant red. The bacteria themselves are pretty much harmless, but the environment they thrive upon is not something most other animals can live with. The lake produces a sort of illusion where the mirror-like surface makes the water look like empty space. Disoriented birds flying over the lake will sometimes dive into the waters where they lose their lives. Once the animal is no longer alive, the salty water mummifies their remains. The exact substance is actually the same one used by the ancient Egyptians, who had a similar but somewhat less drastic lake in their country. It was in 2013 that a photographer stumbled across some of these remains. The photographer was supposed to be taking pictures for a piece on the disappearing wildlife in East Africa, but was fascinated by the calcified remains he found washed ashore. The animals had been well preserved, with details like individual feathers and eyes easy to make out. The photographer placed the animals on branches and in the waters, but highlighted that he didn't move the body parts in any way. The result was a truly scary set of photos from skeleton-like birds and bats, gazing off into the distance while surrounded by the waters that caused their terrifying appearance. Number 1. Creepy photos from haunted prisons usually have some of the most disturbing backstories, and this picture taken at West Virginia State Penitentiary in Moundsville is no different. Moundsville Penitentiary was once dubbed as the most violent prison in America. Today, it's known as one of the most haunted, with apparitions of former prisoners and staff said to still linger within the walls. The prison was open for 119 years, closing in 1995. In that time, overcrowding was often a problem. It would frequently house more than 2,000 prisoners, 3 times more than it was designed for. 3 men would be housed in cells of just 5 by 7 feet. Almost 1,000 prisoners did not leave the prison alive, with illness, prisoner-on-prisoner attacks, and capital punishment claiming many lives. It's some of the people who passed in the most violent manner that are said to still wander the halls and have been spotted by visitors. Even before the prison was closed, it was said to be haunted. A prisoner was frequently seen in a maintenance area that was supposed to be for staff only. When guards raised the alarm, nobody was found and all the prisoners were accounted for. The prison basement is particularly haunted. It was here that a recreation room was housed, used for when the weather was too bad for the allotted yard time. Policing this space was especially difficult, and much of the prisoner-on-prisoner attacks took place here. Visitors have reported hearing unseen people arguing and whispering, as well as other unexplained noises and cold spots. The ghost of an old maintenance man is also said to linger down here. The man would allegedly spy on prisoners and report any infractions to the guards. Prisoners eventually took his life. He now wanders the basement and causes equipment malfunctions. But the paranormal activity is said to spread throughout the rest of the prison, with cold spots, a feeling of constantly being watched, and disembodied footsteps and calls for help being frequently reported. Of the entities that are said to linger here, the Shadow Man is possibly the most disturbing. Who or what this entity once was is unknown, but he's said to lurk in shadowy places and has no features. In 2004, an investigator named Polly Gear photographed the Shadow Man. She is said to have encountered the figure while walking towards the cafeteria. 3 prisoners lost their lives in the cafeteria during a riot, which could possibly explain the haunting. She described the figure as looking like black static and shaped like a person. She took a picture as she backed away, which allegedly shows the figure. Many have tried to debunk the picture as a shadow of Polly herself, though how that would work without casting a shadow on the floor is unclear. Whether or not it is a paranormal entity, it is a creepy image from one of the most disturbing places. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But I've been Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.